I'm Peter Kernahan. I'm from Marling School, and I'm here with Dr. David Webster from the University of Gloucestershire. And we're talking about Buddhism. We've covered a lot in previous videos from the life of the Buddha, different traditions, and teachings like the Four Noble Truths. We're talking just now about the issue of women in Buddhism. And the interesting question is whether the Buddha was a reformer or not. It seems he had to be persuaded to start the order of nuns in Buddhism by his aunt. Tell us a little bit about that, David.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very big area, and I think the area of Buddhism and gender, particularly in relation to women, is one we could probably make another 12 videos about, perhaps next year. So there's an awful lot of issues in it. The incidents you refer to where the Buddha says no the first 3 times he's asked, it's an echo of what happens to everybody who wants to be ordained as a monk or nun, is they always turn down initially. So there's a question of whether it's a ritualistic process to see whether women are serious about and whether they aren't serious about the start of the female ordination line, or whether it really is a demonstration of his reluctance. Now, if you take seriously claims about the Buddha's omniscience, then he can't have reluctance because he's pretty sure one way or the other.
He's already awakened.
He's already decided. It's obviously good or bad. That aside, of course, you have to remember that the early traditions are largely written down, preserved and transferred by men, to some extent for men.
Yes.
So an awful lot of what become quite controlling aspects of early Buddhist tradition and some of the more negative responses to women in the early Buddhist traditions are there as a result of institutions of men organising things and making presuppositions about where men and women would ideally fit into this new community they're making.
Fantastic. Now, I've been reading this book by Bartholomew's, and she's a scholar who's been interested in Theravada in particular, and the experience of women in Theravada Buddhism. She quotes the early text. She's interested in the early texts, and she says there are 4 attitudes to women in the early text and the question is whether these are conflicting attitudes. She says, number 1, there is a soteriological inclusiveness. And that's a good thing, isn't it? What does that mean?
Well, fantastic. Soteriological, I'm sure all A-level students know exactly what soteriological is, but in case anybody young is watching, it's to do with salvation.
Yes.
It's to do with being saved.
Yes.
And so anything soteriological within a religion is about what's the process of salvation. So soteriological inclusivity, I'm just about to say, means everybody can be saved.
And presumably that includes women. So women can be enlightened just like
women can become enlightened, and earlier in Buddhism, it seems perhaps from the time of the Buddha, if we believe the Theravada Pali Canon account of it, that seems quite open and slightly more relaxed. However, with the development of Buddhism, some things creep in. So sometimes you encounter different attitudes that say things like, well, women can become enlightened after they've been reborn as a man.
Yes.
And they have to make a kind of prayer to be reborn as a man. You can clearly see then a kind of attempt to re-establish a certain kind of gender hierarchy.
So that soteriological inclusivist. Second, she talks about institutional androcentrism, meaning male leadership. Tell us a little bit about the problem of institutional Buddhism and women.
Absolutely. So traditional Buddhist institutions are the monastic sangha, the community of monks and nuns the Buddha establishes, and it's established, at least according to kind of the account of early Buddhism, during the lifetime of the Buddha. There were these organisations, and they are very rule bound.
Yes.
They are very organised, and actually most of the falling out in the first few hundred years of Buddhism is about the rules of living together, because living together is really complicated with hundreds of people and hundreds of moving, mobile, homeless people in some respects, because it's a very innovative, unusual community. And these are largely dominated by men, and they set rules that are different for men and women. So there are male rules everybody has to follow, and then for women there are extra rules. Women are identified as the other to the norm from the very beginning of Buddhism. So there is the norm, which is male, and then there is women, which is something other to it. And so it's not just that these extra rules are a bit of a pain and they're inconvenient. They mark women out as being something other than the default position of humanity.
We could go back to our work on textual analysis and do some gender hermeneutics here on that. But perhaps most shockingly, number 3. So number 1, sociological inclusiveness. Number 2, institutional androcentrism. Number 3, ascetic misogyny. Wow, that's a big claim. What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, there is a sense in which the ascetic, the way of living as a Buddhist, it's an absolute kind of model of how the ideal way to live as a Buddhist. They say, well, you can live as a household, as a labor, this is kind of okay.
Yeah.
But the goal, the ideal, the perfect vision of a Buddhist is a man with a shaven head, wearing robes, who's been ordained. Absolutely, he's a bhikkhu, a monk. And so women, to the extent they want to be considered serious Buddhists, have to conform to that model.
Yes.
So they have to fit into a male mould, in that sense. So and it's not so much about the fact that the shaven-headed unusualness, the look of a monastic in Buddhism is more towards the conventional notion of what women look like, and there's all sorts of small micro issues that lie around the idea that vanity is related to different kind of genders differently, and sort of readings to do about that. But this idea that the fundamental perfect idea of what a Buddhist is the Buddha.
Yes.
And the perfect Buddhist is the Buddha, and therefore to be a woman is not to be capable of matching this mould, to be categorically denied access to it. So that typology runs through Buddhism, even when it's much less conscious of it.
Yes. Great. So soteriological inclusiveness, institutional androcentrism, ascetic misogyny, and here we have we're turning positive again here, soteriological androgyny. So Bartholomew's talks about the revalorization of women here, that actually in early texts there is a glorification of the feminine. What do you think she's meaning there?
I think the idea that soteriologically there's something open to men and women is really kind of interesting. And actually a lot of contemporary Western women who find that Buddhism works for them, they find something very powerful and transformative in Buddhist tradition, talk very much about this aspect, that in the core teachings about suffering, the core teachings about how to respond to suffering, about taking responsibility for your own responses to the world, that there is a message in there which isn't marking them out as different. Yes. And we talked in some previous videos about emptiness, about Buddha nature, and about the kind of one way of reading that as a form of radical equality. That's quite a powerful message. This idea that what lies inside you is what fundamentally characterizes you is nothing to do with your gender.
Now, is that going to differentiate Theravada from Mahayana approaches to feminism? Maybe we'll come to that in a second. Just to outline her book, it's a fascinating study. She follows what happened to the order of Buddhist nuns that the Buddha established. What happened to it? We don't have it today in Theravada Buddhism.
No, 12th, 13th century, the Theravada ordination line for women dies out.
Yes.
There have been attempts to re-establish it. And there have been the ordination of Theravada women by Mahayana nuns, but very conservative, orthodox, Southeast Asian Theravada men don't accept the legitimacy of that, because the ordination line has been broken.
What do you see? Does you see this as a cultural accretion, or do you see this as original to the texts?
And that's a conversation that every religion has.
Yes.
And every religion has reformers and advocates from within, people who describe themselves as Islamic feminists, as Christian feminists, and as Buddhist feminists, who will say the fundamental message of their religion is gender-free and is about radical equality, and all the things about women being unequal in that tradition have been stuck on by men over the centuries. Now, that's a very big topic, and there are a lot of arguments either way. We won't sort of settle all over the next 2 minutes. Yeah. But within Buddhism, that analysis that Bartholomew's offers is quite a useful one, because it's a way of disaggregating Buddhism, pulling it apart, and saying, well, actually, these bits are really misogynistic, and there's plenty of that in Buddhism. There's loads of really negative. The Jataka stories that we love so much about the Buddha's previous lives are full of warnings about the wickedness of women and how don't trust them, because it'll end badly if you do, and things. So there's an awful lot of negative things about women in Buddhism, and more so than people sometimes presume with our rosy glow of being outside of many of those cultures in the West. But also many people find in it something quite powerfully transformative about the idea that we are empty of anything defining, such as a kind of gender feature that is essentialist. Yes. And also the idea that in our past rebirths, all of us have been men and women. This kind of core idea that says you might be a man now, your last rebirth maybe you were an animal, it's quite likely you were a woman, and you were definitely having your countless prior lives. So many that going back in time, the Buddha gives up looking at his, there's so many to count. That we've been men and women many, many times and will be again in the future. Yeah. And that's quite an interesting idea, and it makes us kind of think again about who we are.
So modern expressions, the 8 precepts. Women can become halfway monks, it seems today, if they're widows. And that's very interesting. Is it a double standard? Is it a pragmatic thing? Is it a good thing, a bad thing? What do you think about this notion of the 8 precepts rather than the full 10 precepts for women?
Yeah. Well, I think it sounds very much to a non-practicing, non-Buddhist, that it sounds an awful lot like the restrictions we find in other restrictions that have gone so far but no further. Yeah. So you might find within the Anglican tradition, we now just have a diocesan bishop in Gloucester, if there's a woman, and we have a generation or two of women vicars finally. But also there are other restrictions on them. There's still substantial restrictions within traditional Catholicism. So it very much seems to echo the attempts of many religious institutional expressions to give a certain amount of leeway to women, but not full, to hold back. Now, if I was making a prediction, I would say that those people who are resisting that within Buddhism, probably like those who are resisting it within Anglicanism, and probably within other traditions, may find themselves overwhelmed by history. That might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, it might be 200 years, but I'd be surprised if women aren't in 200 years having full access to the 10 precepts.
So let's just widen it out then. Across the traditions, are there any Tibetan lamas that are women? As, we could ask the same of Christianity, of course, and popes. Within broader Zen Buddhism, Chinese forms of Buddhism, what's the position of women? Maybe the role of women in terms of the monastic order is different. Tell us a little bit about how women are treated then within Mahayana Buddhism broadly in different traditions.
Well, the key term in which that is broad, it is so broad. Yes. And certainly you're right to point out no key lamas, no central kind of lamas within the Tibetan tradition are female. I mean, although there is a tradition of minor female figures and more complicated sexual. If you're looking at gender more broadly in Tibetan traditions, sexuality.
Yes, so you have the visualization. That's a very interesting.
Get a whole different
visualization techniques when seeing yourself as a woman and
absolutely. So
having your guru.
Sexuality gets a whole kind of. I'm trying to think of an appropriately scholarly term, but it gets mixed up a lot in
tantric practice.
In tantric and Tibetan Buddhism. Yes. There's all kinds of really kind of interesting things going on. So so even though you may not see the Dalai Lama in the next generation or two as female, you do see an awful lot of a different way of viewing gender generally. And you find in the Far East that there are female nuns. So there are still extant ordination lines of women.
And you can be enlightened if you're not a monk or in any way. So are there any well-known Chan Buddhist women who are considered enlightened?
None I can immediately recall to mind. But there is this idea, however, that of an egalitarian soteriological view in Mahayana Buddhism anyway. So you don't have to be a monk or nun to be enlightened, as you say. You don't have to be a man to be enlightened. So within Mahayana Buddhism, that kind of openness about salvation is considered differently anyway. We've already talked about how nirvana is considered differently anyway. And that is open to a much wider range of people and not through the strict, organised institutions of male hierarchy and monasteries that you find within, say, Theravada. And it's expressed through art and all these other ways of accessing the Dharma exist, which women can access much more powerfully than men as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.